Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores led by Walmart and Target are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Hi, this is Ben Caspit from Tel Aviv with a brand new episode of Own Israel. Israel prides itself on being the only democracy in the Middle East. The Jewish state came by this title honestly, but more and more people are asking whether it's still valid. Benjamin Netanyahu's prolonged rule, the continued bashing of the legal system, of law enforcement authorities, of the state prosecution, of the Attorney General, of the courts by Netanyahu and his people have all come together in the black clouds now overshadowing Israel's democracy. Reality, as reflected in the daily routine of Israel's political and constitutional systems, is not encouraging. For almost 18 months, Israel did not have an elected government. The constitutional political upheaval led to 3 elections, one after the other, and a 4th may now be in the offing. The legislative branch, the Knesset, was almost paralyzed by a series of government-sponsored amendments to the law and other measures designed to curb its power. The Knesset's government oversight functions were trashed. Politicians were demanding that the bureaucrats be silenced, the gatekeepers distanced, and the regulators castrated. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who spent most of his political career defending these hallmarks of democracy, is now leading the charge against them in a desperate attempt to evade the long arm of the law. His trial on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust is already underway in Jerusalem, and his clear interest lies in discrediting the system that led him there. And now the corona crisis is giving rise to legislative initiatives that also call into question Israel's democratic principles. For example, a bill allowing the Shin Bet security agency to track Israelis exposed to the coronavirus has generated sharp criticism. The government is using the Shin Bet's special capabilities against its own citizens to limit the spread of infections. Human rights organizations are arguing that such a measure is unnecessary, inefficient, and undemocratic. Last week, the Knesset approved what critics are calling the Big Corona Law, which greatly limits its own oversight of the executive branch in dealing with the epidemic. The law gives Netanyahu and his alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz almost unlimited power to impose closures and sanctions. This has also prompted broad criticism. Critics of these measures argue that democracies die slowly in the dark. They also warn against the slippery slope of such moves and against the well-known frog phenomenon. By the time the frog realizes it is being cooked alive, it's already cooked alive. Israel is being swept by a growing wave of protests. Some of them stem from a general unease about the democracy under siege. The guest with whom we will discuss this today is one of the leading representatives of Israeli civil society. Professor Karine Nahon is an associate professor of information science in the Lauder School of Government and Ofer School of Communications at the Interdisciplinary Center at Herzliya, IDC, in Israel. The elected president of the Israel Internet Association, chairwoman of the National Committee of Ethics, Regulations, and Artificial Intelligence, and an affiliated associate professor in the Information School at University of Washington. She is the author of the award-winning book Going Viral 2013 and was named on the Marker's list of 10 most influential people in Israel and on Forbes' list of 50 most influential women in Israel. Professor Nahon will be with us right after this short break for commercials. Stay with us.
If you're listening to this podcast, you obviously care about the Middle East, and if you do, you should probably be reading Al Monitor. Al Monitor is a global newsroom headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a network of over 160 contributors around the world. Al Monitor offers first-class reporting and analysis from a range of perspectives and an approach that represents the highest journalistic standards, as well as an award-winning commitment to press freedom and independence. If you haven't done so already, visit us at almonitor.com, check out our articles, and sign up for our free newsletters. There's a lot to choose from, including the Week in Review, an essay that offers unusual insights and forecasts into the region based upon Al Monitor's outstanding reporting. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our Al Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform, on Israel with Ben Caspit, and on the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Thank you for staying with us as we welcome Professor Karine Nahon. Thank you for joining Al Monitor's own Israel podcast. Professor Nahon, shalom.
Shalom.
Let's start with a broad question. Do you think the feeling that many Israelis have that their democracy is under threat is justified? And if so, what indications point to that conclusion?
I do think that the Israelis' kind of estimation and feeling that democracy is under threat has something behind it. I wouldn't say that democracy has fallen, like some of my colleagues do say so, but I do think that we are in a very sensitive position and situation regarding our democratic kind of structure. And we're talking about hurting the gatekeepers. I think you will mention that, but hurting the mass media, hurting the general attorney, attacking different types of enforcement authorities, interrogation authorities, judicial enforcement kind of authorities. All of these indications mean that something is going on. And democracy is a very, I would say, fragile structure of government. And it's very easy to see it fall apart very quickly from one point that you see that things are shaking and the checks and balances are not working as usual.
Because what I think, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about it, is the immune system of the Israeli democracy is not so strong as we thought, because many of the things that you just mentioned happened, and actually no one cared. Talking about the mass media, talking about smearing the attorney general, the police, the prosecutors. We have a prime minister that said on camera in his speech, "Why don't you investigate the investigators?" Such a things, and you can see it all over the streets, that bother me and maybe tells me that something is sick here.
Sick is a too big kind of word for me, but I do think there's a problem, and we can see it by the positioning of the Knesset in front of the government. The Knesset has been weakening for a long time. In proportions next to the government. And the main idea that we see here is that the government cannot operate as usual as it should. People think about the Knesset as kind of an institution that is supposed to legislate, but this is not true. This is not its own the only, role that the Knesset has. The Knesset is very important in its oversight role. The questions regarding the committees, the idea of what we call in Hebrew, the hot dog factory, the idea that the legislation enters into the committees at one point, it gets out in another point, very different. And that means that people ask questions, the member of the Knesset asks questions. All those oversight kind of tools are so important. And I think what you feel is that now with the Corona situation, that all the little oversight tools that we do have that are very weak anyway, have been weakening more and more. And this is a trouble. This is a challenge. This is something that we need to take care of. So it's definitely something that I kind of like think that it's something that is a problem that we need to take care of.
If I'm thinking aloud, when I was a child or younger, young politicians dreamed of becoming an Israeli lawmaker. Becoming a member of the Knesset was their lifelong goal, and it was big. Now, when you see this Knesset, the serving Knesset members, we've just formed a government that occupies 36 ministers out of the 120 Knesset members, and then 18 or 16 vice ministers, undersecretaries, like we say it in English. And in order to be an ordinary member of the Knesset, it's almost a curse. It's almost a humiliation. People, after one term in the Knesset, they demand being a minister or at least an under chairman of a speaker of the Knesset. Something happened here, not so quickly, like you said. I think it's a process that our legislative became something that we don't appreciate anymore.
We don't appreciate, and it's a big mistake. Because eventually, and you saw it in the Corona crisis, eventually when the Knesset was doing things, when eventually they were asking questions, when they were asking for data, eventually things happened. The process of supervision and control is so important in the Knesset, and not only the legislation, because again, in the legislation, you need to have a vote. You have to have a majority, and the majority is already set. But you touched upon a very interesting thing. I think it's not appropriate to have 36 ministers and 16 vice ministers. Definitely in a situation that we are like now, where people don't have basically, money to eat or to feed their children. So I think it's a big mistake. And eventually we have to remember that governments are here to serve us and not vice versa. And it has a kind of a connotation in the last few kind of, speeches that I hear of different ministers that we are here to help them and not vice versa. But definitely, being a member of the Knesset is not the highlight today. And I think it's a big mistake because you can do a lot of things through the Knesset.
I think what we just said is that the very cause that maybe igniting the mass protests that we see now in the streets, and maybe we will touch it later, people feel that their leaders are not there for them, but the leaders expect them to support the leaders. But as I said, maybe we'll touch it later. I want to go into details with you, Professor Nahon. Some people claim that the government is taking advantage of the Corona crisis to expand its powers at the expense of the Knesset, of the judiciary, of civil liberties, of the right to privacy. First, what do you think is the problem of using the Shin Bet's monitoring tools to fight the epidemic? We're talking about our huge, very sophisticated, famous Shin Bet, its goal is to stop and halt terror, and now we are using it to control the spread of the virus. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's for saving life.
So I'll separate the answer into two. The first one is the way the process of decision-making of taking the Shin Bet and making it the big institution that basically locates Corona, I would say contact tracing. The process itself was not accountable. It was not transparent. Just to remind you, it started with different kind of emergency orders that came, and the Knesset did not have any say in it. So in a way, the Israeli public has, in one day, noticed that the Shin Bet is supposed to basically survey the people. Now, in terms of technological efficiency, it might be right, but let's put it in aside for a second because there are problems there as well. But let's talk about the main idea, the main problem, and you touched upon it. The main challenge of having a Shin Bet, a secret service, using it for civilian purposes by itself in a democracy is a problematic thing. I mean, there is no other country, democratic country, that is using its secret service in order to basically try to track people who are in contact of Corona patients. It doesn't happen. You have other type of tools. That's the first thing. Second thing, I don't know if you noticed, and probably you did, since we started this debate, because it's a civilian debate, you can't hide, the technological features of the Shin Bet. And suddenly you have huge institutions that usually is, in Calvin's time. And suddenly people are starting to debate about its technological features, characteristic, what's the false positive, what's the false negative. This doesn't work well, this works well. And suddenly the Shin Bet, who's definitely not used to it, and its main purpose is to tackle and get terrorists wherever they are, suddenly needs to deal with Israeli civilians. It doesn't make sense. And in fact, it jeopardizes its own kind of, core activity, which is very worrying by itself.
And
now, let's get to the...
By the way, I wanted to go on, but even the head of the Shin Bet, Nadav Argaman, was not very enthusiastic, and it's an understatement, handling or using this very important tool that was supposed to be secret
Yes.
in a civil event like a pandemic.
I can tell you historically that heads of Shin Bet have been in that situation of using the Shin Bet tools to other civilian kind of purposes, and they rejected that. And I know at least of 4 different requests that were done by the government of Israel for the Shin Bet to use it, and they refused it. And I think this is why the Nadav Argaman, the head of the Shin Bet, was very reluctant to do it. But the main thing is that they didn't even try a civilian alternative. So that you can't really say this is a tool that works and you're not trying anything else instead. And the big thing is the false positive. In 2 weeks, we had 150,000 people isolated. This means 150,000 people who don't bring money home. And, in the Corona situation where you have 2 weeks, anyway, we were in closure for so long and we didn't work. A lot of the people in the market did not work. And suddenly you are isolated for 2 weeks. This is something that somebody needs to, to make the trade-off, or at least understand the pros and cons, because we can't bring Israel to a situation where people would not have the ability to survive economically. And that's the price. It's a big price.
Because you're the expert in this issue, what do you think is the reason that Israel, such a sophisticated state, would just launch another missile to the space with a satellite, could not develop a civilian tool to replace the Shin Bet's abilities or capabilities to have this tracking of coronavirus patients?
I think partly is because the Shin Bet tool was there. You see, countries that did not have the Shin Bet or did not think about using their secret service, to track their citizens, had to develop a tool like that. And in our case, we had a very easy tool. It was there. Let's do it. Let's use the Shin Bet and track hundreds of thousands of people. By the way, I know at least of 100 cases that came into my attention of people, and I'm talking about people like psychiatrists, like doctors, who are putting their phone at home and not taking their phone because they don't want to be located and scanned by the Shin Bet. So in a way, we are, people are starting to circumvent even the Shin Bet tool. So what are we doing if we are losing the trust of the people? And don't forget, trust is the main tool to fight the corona. If we are losing that, then really we have to rethink using the Shin Bet tool.
Yes, I have friends that live in Europe and got an SMS from the Shin Bet. You have to stay in quarantine now because you were exposed. Let's talk about the big corona bill passed by the Knesset last week. Actually, this bill now enables the government to act freely without the Knesset regulating its actions because of the coronavirus, the pandemic situation. Do you think it's a slippery slope, or just as Prime Minister says, give us the tools to act fast now? When we will be over the crisis, everything will come back to its place safely.
It's very worrying. In fact, you talked about the slippery slope of the democracy. This is the slippery slope of the democracy. Because, when I hear the Prime Minister saying, we have a challenge, we have a blockage because the Knesset is in between. Hey, the Knesset is in between because this is democracy. That's the idea. The idea is that you do have a separation between the branches. The idea is that you do have an oversight, that you can't legislate if you are the executive branch, but the Knesset legislates. And suddenly I understand that you have to make things faster. But still, you have to have a decision-making process that is accountable to people. Again, we return to the trust level. If people won't trust you because you're not accountable, you're not transparent, then what are we doing? Why are we doing that? All the decisions in the government are not transparent. Globes have been trying to get the agreements and the discussions in the government about different closures, about the decision to close businesses, for example, to close, country clubs and to close, cinemas. They couldn't. If that would have been happening in the Knesset, in the parliament, that would have been a different story. Look at what happened in the Corona Committee when the head of the Corona Committee was asking for data. So simple, nothing more than data. And eventually she was basically threatened by the head of the coalition not to continue her job as a kind of a supervision, which is her main job. This is why she's getting money eventually in salary. So this is definitely a slippery.
This bill makes the Corona Committee empty. Now we don't need the Corona Committee. And we had a whole week of discussions in the Corona Committee when we actually realized that the Ministry of Health or anybody else in the government doesn't have data that is so crucial in order to decide whether to open the swimming pools or close them, open the beaches or close them. We just don't have data, and now they will be able to make the decisions without any data, and we will not be able to know it.
As one of the ministers says, don't be a child. You don't want data. You don't need data. I'm joking, of course.
To have data.
Yes, exactly. And yes, part of the Corona bill has been basically taking the powers of the Corona Committee. And we have to, just to remind you, the Corona Committee was created by the coalition agreement. The idea was that there would be one committee that was focused specifically on the Corona, and everybody would have the expertise because it's the same people who are dealing with very similar kind of, challenges and assignments. And now it's all going to be dispersed in between the different committees. Everybody will have to start everything from the beginning. But the big thing of the bill of the Corona is that the oversight is only after it's being legislated by the government. Suddenly the government is the legislator. And this is a very unhealthy situation, especially in the kind of, I would say, flux and in the kind of sensibility that Israel is there constitutionally.
I want to finalize this very interesting conversation in some macro or general issues. I remember a story when the late Minister of Communications, Fuad Ben Eliezer, many years ago when the internet was in the beginning of the internet, someone told him, listen, it was in the internet or on the internet. So he got angry, he yelled at him, and get me the general manager of the internet immediately by phone. Now, in Israel, I think we elected you as the prime minister of the internet. You are the most known and popular expert on in this issue. And I want to ask you the following. We live in a populist age. The internet has made information accessible, fast, and not always accurate. How do you think this affects politicians, their work, their commitment to the mission, their life, our life?
Yeah. So it's not only in Israel, we see it very strongly in different kind of democracies. We see it, for example, in Brazil, the United States, in Hungary, in Israel as well. We see personal politics. That means that if we used to have in the 70s and 80s, the parties were the main intermediate between the public and the elected officials and the elected, our representatives. You don't know really who's the list and who's the party. You see only the head of the parties. And that's what I mean by personal politics. And we have a lot of populism. You mentioned populism. A lot of people don't understand what it means. But when we say populism, we are talking about the idea that the main leader is talking about us versus them, right? We are against the elites. Who are the elites? The elites are journalists like you. The elites are professors like me. The elites are not elected professionals that are the bureaucrats, that are, some people are calling them the deep states, and they are the traitors. That's part of the message of the populist leader. And now we have in the age of the internet another step. It's not only that they are the traitors, it's not only us versus them, but it's me who represent you, the people. So if somebody hurts me, they're actually hurting the people. And that's another step of the populist leader. And it's very interesting because social networks is a wonderful thing, but it gives you also a distortion of what's really going on. And smart populist leaders know to make the illusion as if a lot of people are behind them, as if actually certain types of groups in the population are bad to the will of the people. Of course, I'm saying that as something that shouldn't happen, but that's what's happening with populist leaders. And social networks are part of the rise of I would say personal politics.
And of course of fake news and alternative facts, etc.,
Yes.
etc. And what do you think?
Yeah, people don't care about facts anymore, Yeah. By the way, the corona has changed that. With the corona, suddenly people are looking for the doctors. Suddenly they're looking for the researchers. Give us data, give us data. And this is where the leaders suddenly are in a situation where they can't send the regular message of we'll make it work.
I didn't think about it. This is a very interesting point. It brings me hope back. And I want to ask you, if someone will ask you 20 years from now, in a retrospective, all these social networks, internet, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, is it the benefits are bigger than the burden or the price we pay, or not?
Wow, it's a big question.
It's a very difficult one.
It's a very difficult one because the space of the internet is where the political space is. This is the Hyde Park of today. And of course, people who know how to exploit the space would use it better. The question is, can we build tools to basically minimize the distortions of power interests, or at least to see them? And this is the big question, because no doubt that the fake news, that the fact that the internet is polarized, the fact that you have so much, toxicity and tension on internet has created a lot of challenges to democracy. But eventually, it's a space, and we have to learn how to deal with it, not to close it, of course.
And finally, do you think that moves or decisions like the decision that Twitter got a few days or weeks ago to correct false tweets or news, or only mention, listen, if you want the real data, it's here. Do you think it's a useful or justified?
Well, it depends. It depends, because Twitter and Facebook has different kind of, I would say, guidelines. But if you see, by the way, Facebook has been, Zuckerberg has been saying, I don't want to be the arbitrator of truth. He's been the arbitrator of truth for a long time. The fact that they decide what will be said or not said for regular people, not for leaders, for you and me, that means that they are the arbitrator of truth. By the way, until the corona, they've been very careful not to intervene. I think the corona has changed a little bit of it because of the fake news, because of the fact that was something that they wanted to stop in order to save lives. Still, I think the situation is where we have this year in the United States, election. And for the first time, we see the big platforms that they understand that their platforms are being used and exploited, to kind of like do harm or to use it and exploit it for bad purposes. And they understand that they need to somehow be there. Now, if you notice, they didn't say, Twitter, for example, they said, this is the information that we know about a certain kind of situation. So when the president says something, when the United States president says something, and maybe it's false, then the minimum that they can do is, send people to see other information. It doesn't mean that it will help, but still you have to remember, they didn't delete the information. You can still get to it if you click on it. So they're very careful in not deleting, people who lie, definitely leaders who lie. And if you ask me, I think it's the right thing not to delete it. But we have to understand that platforms are a very strong player here.
It's a step in the right direction. Professor Karine Nahon, thank you very much for this interesting conversation. And we will be back with some final insights right after a short commercial break. Thank you. Shalom.
Thank you.
If you are listening to this podcast, you obviously care about the Middle East, and if you do, you should probably be reading Al Monitor. Al Monitor is a global newsroom headquartered in Washington, D.C., with a network of over 160 contributors around the world. Al Monitor offers first-class reporting and analysis from a range of perspectives and an approach that represents the highest journalistic standards, as well as an award-winning commitment to press freedom and independence. If you haven't done so already, visit us at almonitor.com, check out our articles, and sign up for our free newsletters. There's a lot to choose from, including the Week in Review, an essay that offers unusual insights and forecasts into the region based upon Al Monitor's outstanding reporting. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe to our Al Monitor podcast on your favorite podcast platform, on Israel with Ben Caspit, and on the Middle East with me, Andrew Parasolidi.
Thank you for staying with us. According to Professor Karine Nahon, the Israeli democracy is not dying yet, but there are too many reasons to worry about its stability and future. The combination of mounting political pressure on the gatekeepers, the use of Shin Bet strategic tools to follow Israeli citizens, and the general feeling of emergency, which is a byproduct of the corona crisis, are pushing the fragile Israeli democracy to the wall. The Big Corona Act that enables the government to make crucial decisions without significant supervision from the Knesset is one more red warning light in a series of such warnings that were seen in Israel lately. It is too early to eulogize Israeli democracy, but I think it's never too late to start worry about it. Thank you for listening. See you here next Monday in On Israel in Al Monitor. Take care.